35 centuries before the Christian era, and some 2,500 years before the Old Testament prophets, ancient Egyptians were already pondering the deepest, most mystifying subject of human existence. All societies struggle with the greatest mystery of life, death. But few have approached death with greater directness or with such enormous respect, ceremony, and ritual as the ancient Egyptians. For them, death was just one of a whole series of cycles. The Nile rose and fell, crops were planted and harvested, a person lived and died. But if you were properly prepared, the greatest cycle of all began after death. From the dawn of their history, Egyptians believed strongly in the concept of an afterlife, an existence which could continue for eternity. For these early people, death was simply a transition.
In ancient Egypt, death was ever before the people, because to them it wasn't the great end that it is to us. It's simply a changing of state. And of course, they're going to go on living, and their spirit, their life force, their personality is going to be able to transcend all the actual trauma of death and go on into the next life.
The Egyptian concept of eternal life was somewhat different than that of the Christian cultures which would follow in later centuries. Egyptians were not hoping for a better life, some celestial paradise after death. They simply wanted a continuation of the life they knew and loved here on Earth. An enormous amount of energy in Egyptian society was taken up with the rituals surrounding death. In studying these ancient rites, archaeologists try to learn not only how people died, but, hopefully, more about how they lived. How do you deal with death? It's the old question. Archaeologists are still trying to find out how the ancient Egyptians answered it. We're picking our way through some rice paddies, here in the Nile Delta, on our way to an excavation of a very early burial site. It's Old Kingdom, 4,500 years ago. Dutch Egyptologist Willem van Haarlem is leading an international dig there. And if we don't break an axle as we go along, then we're almost there. Most of Egypt is desert, and the bodies of ancient Egyptians buried there have remained intact for thousands of years. But conditions in the Nile's delta region are very different. Here, the many branches of the great river feed a water table which is very close to the surface. Most things buried in the delta mud decompose quickly. I joined Willem van Haarlem at the ancient cemetery he's excavating in the delta region. For archaeologists like van Haarlem, this is a frustrating place to look for the past.
Should we go and have a look at that?
Yes, we can.
But I was lucky enough to arrive on a day when a body from an early grave was being removed for study. Willem introduced me to Alexei Kohl, a specialist in human bones from Russia. So, Alexei, tell me what you have here. What sex is this skeleton?
We know that it was a male about 25, 35 years old, and we didn't observe any trace of disease on his bones.
So this was quite a healthy person?
Yes, quite healthy.
So here we have the legs, and this is the pelvis area?
Legs, pelvis, you can see arms here.
And the ribs here.
Yes, ribs, yes.
And this is the skull?
Yes,
in this area?
This is the skull, and you can see the jaw here, and
with
teeth.
the teeth.
And 13 beads.
How old is the skeleton?
Very broadly spoken, between 2500 and 2000 BC. So it's between 4,000 and 4,500 years old.
But even with this crude burial, there are offerings placed here which would suggest that even at this early stage, there was a very strong sense of the afterlife and where this person was going after death.
Absolutely. These vessels probably contain some kind of foodstuff. In other burials, we found fish bones in these vessels. So that may have been fish and in some way preserved, salted or something like that.
So you're going to be taking the bones out today and the offering jars, perhaps?
Yes. And if you want, you can help us by taking out some of the beads, for example.
That would be great, thank you.
No Egyptian was buried without preparation for the life to come. This man was sent to eternity with a necklace. I was able to find several stone beads from that necklace, which will be saved for further study.
So, there's the next one. How do you keep track of all these?
Well, we give this number 3 because there's a small one in between we haven't taken out yet. Huh? And then we put them in film boxes with the number written on it. So we can reconstruct the exact order according to the sketch I made.
You must have thousands of film boxes.
Yes, we have. They're very useful for taking samples and small finds and things like that. Yeah. Oh, well,
for as much as Van Gaalem and his colleagues are learning about this 4,000-year-old man, there is much we will never know. What was his name? What did he do to earn his living? Did he have a family? What we can be sure of is that he hoped he could find his way to eternal life. But moving from the world of the living to the everlasting life of the dead was not automatic. It was a complex and highly ritualized event which could only be successfully negotiated by those who had lived a moral life. And even they had to be prepared to overcome many obstacles. Passage to the afterlife occurred in a region the Egyptians called the underworld. And presiding over this deeply mysterious realm was the great god Osiris. The spirit of the dead person was taken before Osiris and a court of 42 other judges. Here the spirit was asked a complex series of questions or riddles about his or her life. Giving the correct answers to these riddles was vital to gaining the afterlife.
They had to pass a moral and ritual test before they could enter the afterlife. There was a judgment of their moral and ethical value. They then had to become empowered with magic in the afterlife so that they could defeat the many dangers which existed there.
The most critical part of this examination was known as the weighing of the heart. In this ceremony, the heart of a deceased candidate was weighed against a feather. If the heart balanced the feather, the person could enter the afterlife. With so much riding on such tests, it was only natural the ancient Egyptians would look for help.
While the physical body was being mummified and entombed, the spirit was undergoing its great journey through the underworld in the hope of being reborn in the afterlife. Now, there were maps, guides to this journey. They're commonly called the Book of the Dead, and it's parts of that you'll find on the walls of every tomb. They were directions, instructions to the departed spirit.
Sometimes these funerary texts go to the extent of either describing or even providing a map of what the afterlife is like and what are the routes through the afterlife. And that's very important because the routes are very dangerous to follow.
For those who failed the exhaustive examination for entrance into the afterlife, what awaited was every Egyptian's greatest nightmare. Those who were judged unworthy were cast into hellish pits and tortured. Those who failed the test were fed to the great beast, Amit, the eater of the dead. But for a people who so loved their land and the life it gave them, perhaps the greatest fear was the thought of spending eternity without their beloved Egypt. His name was Maseharti, general of the army, high priest of Amun-Re, and one of the sons of the pharaoh Pinedjem I. He suffered from severe headaches. We have some of the letters he wrote to his doctor asking for a cure. Well, maybe it didn't work, though he lived to the relatively advanced age of 52. But for all the details we know of his life, to the visitors to this museum, he is just a mummy. From the Greeks and Romans to the Hollywood screenwriters, no part of Egyptian life has more fascinated the world than mummification. And this is a very successful example, which means that as far as Mazaharti is concerned, he is still alive.
The world's fascination with mummies is not a recent phenomenon. Napoleon was intrigued by mummies when he invaded Egypt in 1798. Early archaeologists seemed obsessed with these preserved corpses. Other than gold, nothing dominated their efforts more than looking for mummies. But in their zeal, they weren't always too careful in the way they handled the dead. The result was an imperfect understanding of the meaning of mummification and how this remarkable practice came about. Ancient Egyptians believed that our friend Masahete could continue to live after death only if his body had been preserved.
I think the fact that they did go to so much trouble makes it very clear that the actual body was going to have some continuing existence in the afterlife, and that they would be able to re-inhabit their body, and their body would be able to take on the form of a living being again.
It was critical that the dead person's spirit be able to find its own body, which was the base or home for the spirit. The corpse had to be as recognizable as possible. In the earliest years of Egyptian civilization, preserving the body had been fairly easy. The dead were simply buried in shallow pit graves. The hot desert sand ensured that the body tissues dried out before the corpse could rot. But as Egypt became more sophisticated, people began to want a resting place that was more than just a pit in the sand.
By 3400 BC, upper-class Egyptians were being buried in tombs above the ground. But without a bed of dry sand, their bodies decomposed. What was needed was a better method of preservation, because without the body, there would be no chance of an afterlife. It took the best part of 1,000 years, but what evolved was a highly complex system of mummification.
The earliest methods entailed little more than wrapping the body in linen and covering the linen with a liquid resin. But as time passed, it became apparent to Egyptians that, like all organisms, the human body's internal organs were the first to decay. By the 4th dynasty in 2600 BC, they began removing these organs, and true mummies at last appeared. The process became progressively more sophisticated until it reached its peak in the New Kingdom, some 1,500 years before the Christian era.
Making a mummy began with evisceration. The brain came out in small pieces through the nose. The stomach, lungs, liver, and intestines were taken out through a small incision. Each of them was placed in a special canopic jar, just like these. These jars were then stored close to the mummy so that the spirit could recognize his or her spare parts.
Not all people were mummified in the same way. Like a car buyer being offered a choice between leather or fabric seats, 6 or 8 cylinders, the family of the dead in ancient Egypt could choose what sort of mummy they wanted.
Both the lower and the upper classes all hoped to preserve the body to the best of their abilities, but of course it was a matter of economics, so lower classes couldn't necessarily afford detailed mummification.
There were different levels of mummification in Egypt, even though most mummification was only available to the better off people anyway. But within that group, there were less expensive and more expensive